There has been so much hype around BMNR lately and so much talk around how they structure their financials in order to make their business model works. However, I think one thing that people really fail to explain is that BMNR can do all the financial engineering in the world, but all of that wouldn't help their business model if this one thing doesn't happen. Therefore, in this video, we will be exploring what exactly is that one thing that will make BMNR strategy tick and how that will affect their valuation in the months and years ahead. But as always, potential is a dangerous word, so let's dive in. I think when it comes to BMNR, people tend to focus a lot around the financial strategy that Tom Lee deploys in order to grow their ETH on their balance sheet, right? But I think being overly preoccupied with this really discounts the value that BMNR brings to the Ethereum network. And I think personally, for me, I wouldn't consider myself someone who has heavily invested in crypto in the past, which means that I'm not super in tune with the crypto world. I keep up with some of the news, but not very, very closely. So before this, I only had around 2 to 3% of my portfolio in both Bitcoin and Ethereum, left it there and kind of ignored it over the last 2 to 3 years. And so, what I hope to do is share with you in some very simple terms what I have understood about Ethereum, how it works, and hopefully not use any jargon so that you can understand the value of BMNR and Ethereum and why I am aggressively adding to this company. You see, the first thing you have to understand is that people sometimes call Ethereum a level 1 or a base layer. Don't worry, both of these words actually mean the same thing. Now, I'm going to give you a mental framework to think about this. You can think about Ethereum as somewhat like a computer program, like a Windows or iOS, except it doesn't just run on one computer, right? It runs on thousands of computers around the world at the same time. Now, inside this program, inside Ethereum, there is something called a smart contract. Now, a smart contract is just a small line of code that tells the network what to do when certain conditions are met. Now, this is a very basic example that I'm going to give. It's just to help you understand, right? It's a lot more complex than this, but by and large, what this is a form of a if this, then that kind of rule, right? If this, then that. So, for example, if a person enters the correct PIN number, then release $10 into their account. Once this rule is actually being written, once this smart contract is actually programmed, you don't need a bank and you don't need a middleman in order to enforce this particular rule. Now, to clarify, I think the function that I've just described, right? Keying in the pin and releasing the money. This is the part of the system that banks currently can do as well. But what makes Ethereum special is that if you go through this process with a bank can at any time without your consent choose to add certain fees for transfers and withdrawals, and even reverse or freeze certain transactions without your consent. And so this means that all the power is centralized with the bank, and the unique value proposition for Ethereum is that no one person can change this rule without the consensus of the majority. And so from here, something that I found pretty cool, which I didn't realize initially, is that anyone can actually download Ethereum on their platform and run it themselves, right? So this becomes a lot more tangible for me. So you can actually run the Ethereum software on your computer, and when you do that, your computer it becomes what people call a node, Node. Basically, what this means is that your computer becomes one small part of the entire massive network of computers that are all running the same Ethereum software. Now, you can go to the official Ethereum website, which I'm showing you over here, follow the steps to install it, right? So this software is actually designed to run on the average home computer, which is what they actually put here on the Ethereum website. So technically, right, anyone can do this. Once your computer is running, it becomes part of the Ethereum network. As with everything nowadays, you do need to stay connected to the internet in order for the Ethereum software to continuously keep up with new transactions, right? So as long as your computer is plugged into a power source and connected to an internet, you can be sure that the Ethereum software will be running and keeping up with all the new transactions. So when you plug or when you install the Ethereum software onto your computer, what your computer actually does is that it checks every single transaction from Ethereum's beginning back in, I think, 2015 all the way to today. Imagine once you plug it into the software, once you install the software, you are basically back checking everybody's math homework since 2015 to ensure that nobody cheated. So without getting too technical, when you install the Ethereum software, now this part is a little bit more important so that you can understand how it works later on. The Ethereum software actually comprises of two parts. One part acts as the memory, and the memory section of the software actually helps to execute the transaction as well as record the transaction of who did what. Now, the other part acts as a referee. It makes sure that all of these transactions actually follows the rules. So think about it like football. If someone scores a goal, the referee on the field can actually give the goal to the team. However, you have to bear in mind that even in football, that there are more than one referee watching the game, and these other referees also have the authority to actually pause the play and call for a review of the goal, right? So they can actually tell the referee that is on the pitch that, hey, perhaps that there is a foul and you might want to reverse the goal. And the referee can actually reverse the goal if he agrees with everybody else. So similarly, on Ethereum, if a transaction is found not to follow Ethereum rules, it actually can be rejected, but only if the majority of the referees around the world agree, which is what this second part of the Ethereum software actually does, right? It acts as the referee. So that is exactly what keeps the network honest, right? We are not basing the decision on any one referee, but thousands and thousands of independent referees all around the world enforcing the same rule book. Now, earlier on, I said, anyone can run the Ethereum software on their computer and help to verify the transactions. That is true, but the problem is that not everyone has the time and the money or the technical skills to keep a computer running 24/7 round the clock. And this is where a company like BMNR comes in. Now, instead of one person running a single computer at home, what BMNR does is that they partner with data centers and infrastructure companies to run all these individual Ethereum nodes or computers on a much larger, more professional scale. And this basically ensures 100% uptime and reliability. Now, on top of this, they actually take it a step further. Now, a computer that runs the Ethereum software is called a node, like I said earlier. But when that computer also helps to create and approve new blocks of transactions, it becomes a validator node. So basically, in order for you to do that, any entity that wants to do that must be able to stake 32 ETH, which is basically putting down a security deposit in case you screw up. Now, let me explain this very simply for you so that you can understand what it means to create and approve new blocks of transactions, as well as the whole idea of staking. So you imagine three different scenarios all happening at the same time on the Ethereum network. Now, in the first scenario, John transferred $10 to Jane. In the second scenario, Peter transferred $10 to Sarah. And in the third scenario, Ellen transferred $10 to Kelly. And so, what BMNR does as a validator is that it sees all of these transactions and it pulls them together, right? And writes them down into like a page, a digital record. So, this becomes like a new page in Ethereum's record books. And so, what the validator does, or in this case, BMNR, is that the software that they use checks the transactions to ensure that it follows the rules of the network. And then, once they have approved this, they would broadcast this record that they have put together to other validators around the world. So, for example, BMNR say that, hey, we have seen these three transactions. These three transactions seem fair to us. Do you agree? And when enough validators check the data and agree that everything is correct, this record will then be finalized and permanently added to the blockchain. Okay, so I say again, three transactions happen, BMNR compiles them, puts them on a page, sends this page out to other validators. When enough validators agree with the transactions and they form the majority, this list of transactions will be finalized and added onto the blockchain. And so, what really keeps the integrity of the entire system is that if a validator proposes a fake or malicious transaction, or if they go offline for too long and they doesn't get majority approval, they actually lose part of the ETH that they stake. So, like I said, the 32 ETH, you basically deposit the ETH into this security deposit where it can actually get slashed, or you lose your ETH if you actually approve a malicious or fraudulent transaction, right? But if they do reach consensus, then of course the validators also receive a small reward, which is the staking yield that people talk about, which is around 3 to 4%. So if you think about the three instances that I gave you earlier about the money transfer happening on the Ethereum network, I want to explain to you in a little bit more detail what the job of the validator is in terms of these three transactions when I say they are checking the transactions, so that you can really understand what the validator does. So if you think about the first sentence or the first scenario that we described, John transfers $10 to Jane. So what the validator actually has to do is firstly to check that John really authorized this transaction, right? This could be through his PIN number, or it could be any form of digital signature that he has. Now, on top of that, after verifying that it is John who authorized the transaction, the validator then has to check that John has enough balance in his account, in whatever account, his wallet or his bank account, to send $10 to Jane. Now, and finally, they also have to check that the smart contract has been executed properly, which means the smart contract does allow the transmission of $10 between accounts if the correct PIN or digital signature has been received. So this means that if the contract says subtract $10 from John, add $10 to Jane, this is exactly what happens. Now, once the validator actually checks this, all these three things are in order, they sign off on the transaction, and then this goes into the page of Ethereum's record books. But like I said, this doesn't immediately gets put onto the blockchain. They have to send this out to other validators to confirm the transactions. So suppose the transaction says John transfers $10 to Jane. But when you check the account, John only has $5 in his wallet. Now, if a validator actually accepts this, and the majority of the other validators check the data and say, hey, this is not true. John only has $5. He can't send $5. He can't send $10 to Jane, and they actually reject this transaction. The validator that approved the transaction will lose their staked Ethereum. So, of course, it's not so easy to lose your Ethereum. Like I said, this is a lot more complex. It must be provably invalid. But I'm not going to get into the weeds of this. It's just helping you understand how ETH works, right? They compile transactions, they check it. If they give a false positive, they can actually lose their staking reward, which basically incentivizes all validators to basically keep the integrity of the network. And I think interestingly, how this actually links back to your single computer, which was what I was talking about earlier, is that once all of these validators actually agree on the transaction and puts the page onto the blockchain, your computer that is running the Ethereum software will also receive this new block of data. And the job of your computer is to check that these validators have done their work correctly. And this checking of each other's work is really what keeps the network transparent and secure, right? Because everyone is constantly verifying someone else's work. And so that is why we are seeing Wall Street begin to trust the Ethereum network even more, and we're starting to see a wider adoption of Ethereum. And the main question over here is, where does BMNR fit all of this? You see, financial institutions like BlackRock, Franklin Templeton, or even JP Morgan, they will not choose to build on the technology itself unless they can be certain that the network will not go offline, the rules of the network cannot be changed just by anybody, and the system must be safe and predictable. And so they're basically looking for something that is as reliable or even more reliable than the current Swift system that they have, but everything must be on chain. And so all Ethereum has done before the entrance of BMNR is to provide a technology that can do that. But the institutions still need trusted operators in order to run the critical infrastructure of Ethereum. And that is what BMNR does as a validator. And BMNR can really act as a bridge between Wall Street and the blockchain. You see, because BMNR is a public company, this means that they are constantly audited, they are regulated and publicly traded, which means that they have to make some disclosures. Now, all of this really gives Wall Street the peace of mind that someone that they trust is helping to secure the network that they are building on. And so as BMNR run their validator nodes with, they are not just using any old computer, they are doing so with enterprise grade software, which means that they can actually ensure 100% uptime. Plus, on top of that, they also have the incentive that they receive through the staking yield as well as the appreciation of ETH that basically incentivizes BMNR to be an honest actor, to be a benevolent entity, as Tom Lee would call it, in the entire ETH network. And here is the catch. Now, in order for anyone to carry out any sort of malicious or fraudulent transaction on the Ethereum network, what they would need to have is control over a certain percentage of the staked Ethereum. Okay, I repeat myself, of the staked Ethereum, and I'm not talking about the entire supply of Ethereum. So I'm specifically, referring to the number of Ethereum that validators actually deposit. So the bad actors would need to control a certain percentage of that. And so depending on the activity that they want to carry out, if they just merely want to stall a transaction, they would need to at least control 1/3 of the staked ETH supply. However, if they want to affect the outcome of a certain transaction, then they would need a super majority, making it around 2/3 or 67% of the staked Ethereum. So at the time of recording, there are around 120 million staked ETH, which is what you're seeing over here. This is in circulation, the total supply. And in terms of the number of staked ETH, if we take a look at this website, it tells us that there are around 35.7 million. So for ease of calculation, I'm just going to be using 36 million staked ETH over here. So what this means is that for anyone, right, to carry out any sort of fraudulent activity, you will need to have significant control over this 36 million staked ETH that you're seeing over here. Now, currently, it is unclear whether or not BMNR is staking their ETH and how much. But I want to show you using very simple math how they can actually help to secure the network. So we know that BMNR eventually hopes to get to around 5% control of the entire ETH supply. So that means around 6 million ETH tokens. Now, if you add this 6 million ETH tokens that they have onto the already staked 36 million ETH, this would bring the total amount of staked ETH to be around 42 million. So which means for any bad actors at this point in time to perform certain actions, they will need to have a good amount of control over this 42 million staked ETH. Earlier on, like I said, if a bad actor just wants to stall a transaction, they need 1/3 of the staked ETH, which means 33%, right? 33.333% of this. Oops, sorry, I just realized I need to put an equal sign in front times this, which would make it around 14 million shares. 14 million shares, 14 million ETH. So if a bad actor wants to stall any transaction on the Ethereum network, they would need to have control of around 14 million ETH. Now, in order for them to affect an outcome, they would need to have 67% or 66.67% of the total staked ETH, which would put this, whoa, again, forgot. Let me key this in, times, you would need around 28 million ETH. I am assuming, let's say, BMNR doesn't stake their Ethereum at all, and there are 42 million ETH being staked in total, not including BMNR. If a bad actor wants to acquire 14 million ETH, they would need to acquire around 33% of the outstanding staked ETH. And if they want to acquire 28 million ETH, they would need 66.67%. However, if you introduce BMNR into the picture and you assume that they hold around 6 million ETH, this means the outstanding supply is only 36 million instead of 42 million. Earlier on, how we get this 33 million, like I said, you just take 14 million over here divided by 42 million, right? So that's how you get 33.33%, which is over here. But on this side of the equation, if you assume that BMNR holds a certain amount of ETH, now the outstanding, and we presume that BMNR will not be selling to all these bad actors. This means that the bad actor will now have to purchase 14 million Ethereum out of the circulating supply of only 36 million, which makes it a lot harder, right? Because now they have to purchase nearly 39% of the outstanding supply if they want to stall certain transactions, and if they want to make changes to the outcome or they affect the outcome of a transaction, they will need nearly 78% of the outstanding supply of staked ETH. So what BMNR does, in essence, is to lower the liquidity of the staked ETH on the ETH platform, and this basically drives up the price of Ethereum, which makes it hard for anyone to gain control of the network without visibly bringing attention to themselves, as well as the increasing price of Ethereum. And if you actually extend this example out into the future, you assume that BMNR has a 10% holding of Ethereum, which is around 12 million ETH, if I'm not mistaken. Yes, 12 million ETH. And you assume that this grows to around the entire ETH stake supply grows up to around 38 million ETH. This puts the total amount of staked Ethereum at around 50 million. You can see over here the numbers change for themselves. Should any bad actor wants to store a transaction, they would need to acquire 16.7 million ETH out of the 50 million. And if they want to affect an outcome, they would need over 33 million ETH out of the 50 million, right? And what that means is that if BMNR actually holds the 12 million ETH on their balance sheet and reduces the liquidity of staked ETH, for any bad actor who wants to just stall the transaction, they would need to acquire 43.8%, or let's call it just 44% of the remaining staked ETH, which because now they're acquiring 16.7 million out of 38 million staked ETH. And if they want to affect the outcome, they would need to acquire 87 or 88%, with 33.3 million out of the 38 million ETH that are outstanding. And therefore, from here, you can see as BMNR grows their position, right, it becomes harder for a bad actor to come in and make any sort of fraudulent or malicious transaction on the Ethereum network. Now, the concern is, what if BMNR grows too big? That is something that we're going to answer in another video, because the Ethereum network itself has certain preventive features that basically de-incentivizes any one entity from becoming too big of a validator node. Therefore, for Wall Street, with BMNR acting as a bridge, they actually feel safe to build on Ethereum, and that is exactly what we are seeing today. Right? Take Shopify, for example. Back in June, they launched support for USDC payments via an Ethereum Layer 2 base network, and that means hundreds of thousands of merchants can now accept stablecoin payments and ETH compatible assets in everyday transactions. And if you look at the more recent news, you can take a look at Alipay via the N Group. They have around 1.4 billion users on their platform, and they have launched a new Ethereum built layer 2 network called Jove, and that aims to bring, the real world financial assets on chain with enterprise grade scale. But these aren't just small experiments, they are major signals that the infrastructure layer, the Ethereum network itself, is being trusted not just by crypto natives, but by larger global brands, right, in both e-commerce as well as in fintech. But it's not just these e-commerce and fintech companies that are trusting the Ethereum network, because we are also seeing big reputable institutions like BlackRock and JP Morgan start to move some of their transactions and some of their assets onto the blockchain. But really, this is just one part of BMNR's value to the entire ETH network, and why they can help to increase the rate of adoption of Ethereum across Wall Street. Because very simply put, as Wall Street continues to build on ETH becomes more valuable. And like I said earlier on in this video, the way I think about ETH is the same way I think about Windows and the iOS, which means it is only as valuable as the people who build on their network. Therefore, as institutions adopt ETH, it causes the price of Ethereum to rise, which definitely benefits BMNR because of the number of ETH they have on their balance sheet. But I believe this benefit is really just scratching the surface, because we're not talking about a one-time benefit, but a virtuous cycle that can keep benefiting BMNR and the entire ecosystem again and again. And I speak more about that in my next video, and I'll see you in the next one.